Welcome to State Switching with CHOPS.
In TouchDesigner, one way that we can talk about state is to think about this as a snapshot of the parameters that are driving your project. Let's take a look at some simple ideas that we can use to help manage state with just CHOPS. To get started, let's add a button component here into our network. Next, let's go ahead and right-click on the output of our button and add a null chop here so we can see the output of our button component. If we make our button viewer active, we'll see that we can turn it on and off. And we can also see that this is a representation of our value parameter. Now, this is a relatively simple idea or simple way of thinking about state, but in this case, our parameter holds the state of our button, and we can actually see how we can interact with our button or interact with the parameter to change that. Now, we can use that in lots of different ways. And in fact, one of the simplest ways that we might think about this would be to say add a table dat here to our network. In our table dat, let's go ahead and make it viewer active with the A key. Right click over on our row, add another row below, and we could think of this as just off and on. This is a binary state. We only have two values we can work with, 0 or 1, and that is one way we could think about that is as an off and on state. We could add a text top here into our network. And in our text top, let's go ahead, grab our table dat and use that for the dat parameter here in our text top. Let's make our null1 viewer active, grab that v1 channel and use that as the dat row parameter and set that as a chop reference. We can also go ahead and get rid of our default text here. And now we'll see that as the state of our button changes, what we see inside of our text top changes. Now this is an important idea because we can actually use this and push this a little bit further. So let's set up one other example. Let's go ahead and add one more button component here into our network. Let's this time change it to be momentary instead of toggle down as a button type. This time we'll connect our button component to a count chop. Now our count chop, we'll see that as we click on our button, we increment our count. Let's make a few changes to our count chop. On the count page, let's set our limit to loop min max, and let's set this to say just 2. We can reset our values here, and now we'll see that as we click on our button, we increment from 0 up to 2, 0, 1, 2, back down to 0 again. Now we could take advantage of this same idea, right? We might say do the same kind of thing we've already done here. So let's add a table dat to our network. Let's go ahead and head over to the fill page, set this to set size. We'll keep it at 3 rows. We only need 1 column. We can fill this in with off, standby, and on. Let's add a text top here into our network. And let's go ahead and use this table dat as our dat parameter in the text top. And let's use that v1 channel to be the dat row parameter as a chop reference in our text top as well. And we can also get rid of the default text. Here we'll see that as we click on our button, we're incrementing through our different rows. Now in this case, we're not holding state any longer inside of our button. Instead, we have this index, and the index from our count is helping us understand what we should be displaying. Now let's take this idea and go a little bit further with it. So we've seen what that looks like if we hold that information inside of, say, the row of a table. But another way that we might think about this would be, say, to add a constant chop here into our network. And let's set up a few other things. Let's connect this to a null chop. And while we're at it, let's call this null bars. Now, we need a few other things in our network, so we might, for example, add here a movie file in. This is a simple way for us to get started. I'm going to go ahead and pick a different image. I think in this case, I might pick the Trillium. And let's go ahead and connect this to a few other other texture operators. So I'm going to grab a level top here, and then I'm also going to grab a monochrome top as well, and we'll end all of this with a null top. Now I want to be able to see this, so I might quickly go ahead and add a container component just so we can see it more easily. And I'm going to go ahead and set my null2 to be the background. And I'm going to change the resolution of this to be 1280 by 720, and we'll just make that a little bit bigger in our network so it's easier for us to see. All right, so what might we do here? Now, in this particular case, I want to think of my constant as being the holder of state. So my constant's going to hold all of the state values that I want to use for my texture operator network. What does that look like? Well, let's think first about our monochrome top here. So we have this monochrome parameter. So I might head over to my constant chop and add a mono channel here. I'm going to go ahead and from the null in this case, I'm going to grab that mono channel and I'm going to bring that over and use a chop reference to assign that here to my monochrome top. And in my level top, I might also want to think about maybe this invert and contrast. So back on my constant, I'm going to add 2 more channels, one for invert and one for contrast. Now I'm going to grab invert. I'm going to go ahead and assign that as a chop reference. And I'm also going to grab contrast and assign that as well as a chop reference. I'll head back to constant 1 and let's turn that contrast up to say 1, its default setting. Now in this case, the state of all of these parameters is stored inside of this constant. Now if I wanted to create another state, what I might do is I might make a copy of my constant chop and use this as a way to hold my second state. So how can I move between these? Well, let's go ahead and add a switch top, or excuse me, a switch chop here into our network. And I'm going to connect both my constant 1 and my constant 2. I'm going to change the index to 1. And now I'm going to make changes here inside of my constant 2. So for example, I might turn up the monochrome and I might turn invert all the way up. Let's make one more state. We have one more. I'm going to head back to the switch chop. I'm going to change this to an index of 2. And this time I'm going to go ahead and bring mono down. I'm going to bring contrast. Actually, let's turn that up to 2. So it's very contrasty. And I'm going to leave it in this case inverted. Now here, our state for how we want to understand what's happening with our tops is all stored inside of these constants. And we're moving between these here with our switch chop. Now, what we might do is we might take our count. Let's add a null chop here. And in this case, we can grab that V1 channel and we'll do the same kind of idea. We'll assign that as a chop reference here to our switch chop. And now our button gives us the freedom to move between our different states. Now this is great and I like this a lot, but we don't always want to move only linearly through our different states. So our button, right, it's only going to go 0, 1, 2 and then back around again. So one other thing that we might want to think about is how could we represent or how could we build a way to move more seamlessly between these different switch states? Let's go ahead and add a container component here into our network and let's build a set of radio buttons really quickly. Here inside of our container, let's add a button component, and in this button component, we can set this button type to be radio down. Let's change the label for it. So we're going to turn on our expression here and we will use an F string to format this. So I'm going to call this state space curly braces me dot digits. This will use the digits of the button to fill in what we've got here. And we only have 3 states for right now. So we only need 3 buttons here inside of our container. Now we'll make one other change. I'm going to highlight all 3 of these on the layout page. I'm going to make sure these are set to fill and fill. And we'll see now that we head back up to one level in our network, we'll see our container 2, if we change the children to be aligned top to bottom, we now have a nice little set of state 1, 2, 3. Let's next go ahead and grab a panel chop here. I want to look at this container 2 panel, and I want to grab out of this just the radio values. And so what we'll see now is that if we make our container 2 viewer active, we can click through these different radio buttons and we can get to the different indices for these. Now we've already set up a reference here, so I can go ahead and take advantage of this null. So I can go ahead and wire this up. Now we'll see we do have a problem. What's going on is it looks like that we used previously this V1 channel name, and here it's called radio. Here on our panel chop, let's go ahead and rename this to V1, and that should clear up our issue. So now we have an easy way to say move between these different states that we've created and move through them non-linearly. So we might even think about if we want to create another state, we could copy and paste our constant, add that to our switch. Let's go ahead and turn, say, mono down and invert down. This will just be a high contrast. And let's go ahead inside of our container and add one more button so we can copy paste. We've got one more radio button here added for us. And now we should be able to go ahead and see what our fourth state is. There are lots of ways to think about state in TouchDesigner. There are lots of ways to work with state and hold on to state. And this is just one way that we might get started for thinking about how we hold on to the state of our project and move between those states with something like a switch chop.